I sat in the dark that night with my heart pounding and my hands trembling, staring at the glowing screen in front of me. And what I saw there broke something inside me forever. Because it was my own son in my kitchen, laughing while he dug through my purse as though I was already gone. Thank you for watching my story. It means more than you know. And before I begin properly, I would love for you to tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It helps me feel like I am not sitting here alone. My name is Felicia, and I was born and raised in America. I have lived a long life with its share of joys and struggles, and even now as I sit here remembering, I can still feel both the weight of my years and the strength they have given me. I want you to understand something about me before I tell you the rest. I am not a rich woman, but I have always managed to provide for myself with honesty and with dignity. And though I have seen many seasons pass, I never thought I would live to see the day my own flesh and blood would treat me in the way that I was treated. I carried him through sickness and through hard winters. I worked long hours when others slept, and I saved small amounts of money here and there, tucking it away not for luxuries but for medicine, for food, and for a little peace of mind when my body grew weaker. All of that history sits inside me like an old chest full of memories, some of them polished bright with pride, and some of them dulled with sorrow. But none of it ever prepared me for the moment when trust slipped through my fingers. I used to believe that if you gave love and care without holding back, it would be returned in kind. But as I sat in front of that screen, the light flickering across my tired face, I realized that love can sometimes turn into greed, and care can be met with betrayal. It is a hard lesson to learn, and I never wanted to learn it from him. Yet life does not always give us the choice. It simply shows us the truth whether we are ready or not. And that night, with my name, my history, and my country behind me, I felt the truth pressing down heavier than I had ever felt before. I have always believed that the foundation of every family rests on trust, on the simple understanding that no matter how hard the world outside becomes, inside these walls there should be safety, warmth, and a place where one's heart can finally rest. I built that foundation with everything I had, not just through words, but through action, through years of sacrifice that no one else ever saw. Waking before dawn to stretch every coin, mending clothes until my fingers ached, preparing meals out of nothing more than scraps, and still finding the strength to whisper encouragement to him when he felt the weight of life on his young shoulders. I carried the memory of his first steps, the sound of his laughter when he was small, and the tears he shed when life was unkind. And in those moments, I swore to myself that no matter what happened, I would always be the one standing beside him, steady and unshaken, even if my back bent and my bones weakened with age. But over the years, small cracks began to show in that trust. Cracks I chose not to see at first, because a mother's heart clings to hope, even when reason warns her otherwise. I noticed the way his eyes wandered toward the things I had carefully saved, the quiet envelopes tucked into drawers for my medication, the journal where I poured out my fears, my dreams, and my confessions to no one but these pages. I told myself he was just curious, that he meant no harm. But a quiet unease began to live in me, whispering at the edges of my thoughts each time he asked too many questions about where I kept my important papers, or when he laughed at how careful I was with money. You see, I am a woman who has lived long enough to know the difference between a passing glance and a hungry stare, and I tried to push it away, tried to remind myself of the boy I once knew. But the unease would not leave me. It grew stronger each time his wife visited, and I saw the way she looked around my home, her eyes sharp, calculating, as though she were not visiting family but assessing what could be taken, what could be turned into an opportunity for them to live more comfortably, while I was left with less. Still, I said nothing, because silence can sometimes feel like the only way to keep peace, and I told myself I could bear a little discomfort if it meant the family bond was not broken. But silence has its price, and in that silence I let myself become blind to the storm gathering inside my own home. That night, when I sat watching the footage with the repaired camera, every suspicion that I had pushed away returned with cruel clarity, and I realized that all the sacrifices, all the love, and all the trust I had invested were being mocked right under my own roof. The hardest part was not the theft itself, but the laughter. The way they read my journal aloud and turned my private thoughts into a performance, as though my life and my pain were nothing more than a joke for their amusement. That laughter pierced deeper than any blade could, because it told me in the clearest way possible that the bond I had treasured for a lifetime had been shattered, and I was left holding the pieces alone. As I sat there staring at that screen, the glow of the footage lighting up my tired face, I felt as though time itself had stopped, as if the walls around me had grown heavier with each sound of their laughter. I could hear them in my head even after I muted the volume, their voices echoing like cruel reminders that my love had become their game, and it broke me in ways I cannot fully describe. I thought of the countless nights I had gone without so that he could have more, of the winters when I kept the heat lower to save a few dollars for his school supplies, of the hours I spent alone working and saving and telling myself it would all be worth it when I saw him live a better life. And now here he was, standing not as the boy I had sacrificed for, but as a man I could hardly recognize, a man who mocked the very words I had written when my heart was heavy and I needed somewhere to lay down the weight. My journal had been my only confidant, the place where I whispered the fears I never wanted to burden him with, the place where I confessed my loneliness and my aches, and hearing my words twisted and ridiculed left me feeling exposed and stripped of dignity. I wanted to cry out. I wanted to storm into that kitchen and demand an answer, but something inside me froze, and instead I sat still, quiet, my hands trembling on the mouse, holding back the scream that built in my chest. And in that silence another thought came, sharp and clear, like a blade cutting through fog. I realized that rage would give them exactly what they wanted, another chance to call me dramatic, another excuse to turn their betrayal into my weakness. So I held my tongue and let the silence wrap around me. And as it did, I understood that this silence was not weakness, it was power. And with that power, I could choose not to react, but to prepare. That night became the turning point in my story, the moment where sorrow began to harden into resolve, where the tears I did not shed turned into quiet strength, and where I decided that if they believed I was blind, I would let them believe it a little longer. Because what they did not know, what they could not see, was that the camera had seen it all, and so had I. And the time was coming when the truth would no longer stay hidden in the glow of a small screen, but would stand in the light for everyone to witness. The hours that followed felt endless. My body sitting in one place, but my mind running through every memory like pages in a book I could no longer close. And with each thought, the wound cut deeper, reminding me that the boy I had loved with every part of my soul had chosen to stand against me rather than beside me. I thought of his first day at school when I held his hand a little tighter so he would not feel afraid. I thought of the nights when he came home late and I stayed awake just to make sure he returned safely. I thought of the meals I skipped quietly so he would have a second helping without ever knowing why. And all of those sacrifices seemed to have been buried under the sound of his laughter as he stole from me without shame. It is one thing to lose money, it is another to lose dignity. But the greatest loss is the shattering of trust. For trust once broken is not easily rebuilt, and as I watched him and his wife treat my home like a treasure chest to be looted, I realized that the trust I had guarded all my life was gone forever. My chest ached not just from sorrow, but from the weight of decisions pressing down on me. Because I knew in that moment that I had a choice. I could confront them and unleash my pain in a storm of anger, or I could do what they never expected. Stay silent, stay calm, and turn that pain into something stronger than revenge. My hands were trembling, yes, but my spirit was not broken, because inside that trembling there was a spark that told me I had endured worse storms before, and I would endure this one too. I knew then that I could no longer be the mother who overlooked mistakes, who forgave too quickly, who carried the burden of silence so others could live comfortably. No, this time I would not shield them from the truth of their own actions. This time they would face themselves without my excuses softening the blow. And as the footage played again and again, The truth became heavier. Yet with that weight came clarity. Clarity that silence would be my armor, preparation would be my weapon, and dignity would be my shield. And though my heart was broken, I also knew I was not defeated. I was only waiting, watching, and deciding when to turn their laughter into their own undoing. When the sun finally rose the next morning, my body felt heavy, as though the weight of the night had settled into my bones. Yet my mind was sharp, clearer than it had been in years. Because the betrayal had stripped away all illusions and left me face to face with the truth I had long avoided. I moved slowly through the house, touching the walls, the furniture, the little keepsakes I had gathered over a lifetime, and instead of comfort they now felt like witnesses to a crime. Silent objects that had watched as the trust I once guarded had been trampled under careless laughter. I brewed myself a cup of tea, and as the steam rose, I thought of the countless mornings when I had done the same, when life still felt steady, and the thought of being betrayed by my own blood seemed impossible. And I realized that nothing would ever taste the same again, not because the tea had changed, but because I had. And yet, within that sorrow, there was something else. A strength that came quietly like the morning light, reminding me that I had not survived this long by being weak, reminding me that every challenge I had faced had prepared me for moments exactly like this, when silence had to be turned into action. I sat with the knowledge that I could not undo what I had seen, nor could I pretend it had not happened, because once truth reveals itself, there is no closing your eyes and wishing it away. I thought about confronting him, but the image of his smirk as he slipped the money into his pocket told me it would be useless. He would deny it, twist it, and make me feel like the fool. And I was done allowing myself to be made small. So instead of shouting, I reached for the phone and dialed a number I had not used in years. The number of someone who owed me nothing but gratitude. Someone who had once been a little boy under my care and had since grown into a man of integrity and purpose. A man who now worked as a lawyer. My voice shook as I told him what I had seen, not because I doubted my words, but because speaking them aloud made the betrayal even more real. And when he answered me with calm assurance that he would help, that he would stand by me, I felt a flicker of relief. A reminder that even when blood betrays you, kindness sown long ago can return to you in unexpected ways. Hanging up the phone, I knew the road ahead would not be easy, but I no longer felt alone. For I had an ally. And with his help, my silence would no longer be just endurance. It would become the foundation of a plan that would protect me and reveal the truth in a way they could not escape. After that call, something inside me shifted. The fear that had held me down through the night began to loosen its grip, replaced by a calm determination I had not felt in years, the kind that rises only when you know you have no choice but to stand tall. I gathered my important papers, the deeds, the savings, the small envelopes of money I had tucked away with such care, and I placed them into a folder with hands that no longer trembled, because now every action had purpose. I left the house earlier than usual, locking the door behind me with the quiet certainty that by the time I returned, nothing would be the same. The streets looked ordinary, people going about their lives, but to me the world had changed, because I was walking not as a woman weighed down by betrayal, but as one carrying the strength of truth and the promise of justice. At the lawyer's office, I explained everything, and he listened with respect, never once making me feel small or foolish. And when he assured me that I had the right to protect myself and everything I had worked for, a new fire lit in my chest. Together we moved quickly, transferring the house out of my name, closing the accounts, making sure every resource that could be touched by greedy hands was sealed away beyond their reach. And with every signature I placed on paper, I felt a layer of their power slipping away from them, leaving me stronger and more secure. I walked out of that office lighter than I had been when I entered, because I knew that I had not allowed betrayal to define me. I had chosen instead to take back what was mine and to do so with dignity. And as I made my way back home, the thought settled deep in my heart that sometimes the quietest decisions, made without shouting, without tears, are the ones that change everything. And though my heart still ached, I knew I was no longer standing as a victim, but as someone ready to show them that the camera was not the only witness, I was. And I had turned what they thought was weakness into the very strength that would undo them. By the time I returned home, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in colors that felt far too gentle for the storm brewing inside me. And yet that same quiet beauty reminded me that endings can also be beginnings if you choose them to be. I walked into the house and looked around carefully, not with suspicion this time, but with the eyes of someone who had already taken control, because I knew every drawer, every corner, every envelope they thought belonged to them was now beyond their reach. I sat down at my desk, opened my old laptop, and with a steady hand I prepared the final step of my plan, gathering the footage from the camera, the laughter, the mockery, the theft, all of it carefully saved so that it could no longer be denied or hidden. I wrote a short email, only a few words, nothing dramatic, nothing loud, just the truth delivered without anger. And I attached the file for every member of the family to see. The subject line was simple, almost soft, yet sharp enough to cut through every excuse they might offer. I titled it, "What You Don't See." And as I pressed send, a calmness washed over me, because I understood that sometimes the most powerful voice is not the one that shouts, but the one that quietly reveals, leaving no room for lies. When I closed the computer, I leaned back and breathed deeply, realizing that the truth was no longer mine to carry alone. It now belonged to everyone who saw it, and whether they chose to judge, to pity, or to stay silent, the choice was theirs. But the burden was no longer resting only on my shoulders. That night I went to bed without fear, without the ache of wondering what else might be stolen in the dark. Because I had already taken from them the one thing they thought I would never take back, the control they believed I had lost. And as sleep finally found me, I knew that when they returned the next day, it would not be me waiting to explain myself. It would be the truth staring them in the face, undeniable, unshakable, and stronger than any excuse they could try to build. The next morning I rose earlier than usual, not because I could not sleep, but because I felt a strange calm that urged me to meet the day with clear eyes and a steady heart. And as I moved about the house, I no longer felt the weight of fear pressing against me. Instead, I felt the quiet strength of knowing that everything had already been decided. I made myself a simple breakfast, and while the kettle sang its soft tune, I thought of how many mornings I had spent worrying, counting every dollar, praying that my sacrifices would one day return to me in the form of love and respect. And now I understood that sometimes sacrifices are not rewarded by the same hands you gave them to. Sometimes they return through the choices you make to protect yourself when no one else will. I looked around the rooms, each corner familiar, each item carrying its own history, and though betrayal had cast a shadow over them, I also saw them differently, not as reminders of what had been taken, but as symbols of what I had saved. For nothing of true worth could be stolen from me now. Not my dignity, not my clarity, and certainly not my strength. I thought of the email already out in the world, carrying with it the undeniable truth, and I imagined the faces of my relatives as they opened it. The silence that would fill their homes when they watched, the shame that would cling to them when they saw how laughter had turned into evidence, how greed had turned into exposure. And I knew then that justice did not always need courts or police. Sometimes justice is simply allowing people to reveal themselves, to show the world who they truly are when they think no one is watching. I left the house once more that morning. The folder of documents already secured, the accounts already closed, and as I walked down the familiar street, I felt the air lighter, almost as though even the wind recognized that something inside me had shifted, that the woman who once carried fear now carried resolve. I spent the day tying up the last of my plans, ensuring that every loose thread was gathered, every key detail secured, and by the time the sun began to sink, I knew that I had not just reacted to betrayal, I had reclaimed my life from it. When I returned home that evening, I sat quietly in my chair, letting the silence fill the room, and I thought of how silence had once been my prison, but had now become my ally. How it had once been the weight of secrets, but had now turned into the vessel of truth that carried me safely through the storm. I no longer feared what might happen when they discovered what I had done, because I had already made peace with it. I had already decided that whatever storm came, I was ready to meet it with calm eyes and an unshaken heart. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of freedom, not because the betrayal had vanished, but because I had taken back control. And in that control, I found a kind of peace that no one could steal from me again. That evening, as the house settled into its familiar quiet, I thought about how many nights I had once spent dreading the sound of footsteps, waiting for the creak of a door that meant my belongings were no longer safe. But this time, I did not feel dread. I felt anticipation, a calm awareness that soon they would discover everything had changed. I pictured them walking through the door, expecting to find the same home, the same comfort, the same resources they believed were theirs to take without asking, and instead they would find emptiness, not just in the drawers or the envelopes, but in the trust they had carelessly destroyed. I could almost hear their voices rising, the questions, the excuses, the angry denial. And yet I did not flinch at the thought, because I knew the email had already spoken for me. Every word and every image captured by that camera was now in the hands of those who mattered most, and no lie could erase what had been seen. I imagined their faces as they scrolled through the footage, the nervous shifting, the hollow laughter dying in their throats as the truth played out in front of them, leaving no place to hide, no excuse strong enough to cover the shame. And while they would scramble for explanations, I would be sitting in my chair, steady and unshaken, knowing that I had done what needed to be done without ever raising my voice. The beauty of it all was that the truth had not required anger. It had not required confrontation in the heat of the moment. It had required only patience. The kind of patience life teaches you when you have endured loss and disappointment and still managed to rise again. I realized then that sometimes the most powerful confrontation does not happen face to face. Sometimes it happens in the silence of a message sent, in the cold clarity of evidence revealed, and in the unspoken strength of a woman who decides she will no longer be deceived. That night, as I closed my eyes, I felt no fear for the morning, only certainty that when they returned, they would be forced to look into the mirror the camera had held up to them. And whether they chose to deny it or accept it, the truth was no longer mine to carry alone. It belonged to all who saw it, and its weight would rest on their shoulders, not mine. When the door finally opened the next day and they stepped inside, I did not rush to greet them. I stayed still, listening to the sound of their hurried footsteps and the low voices that carried the weight of unease. Because by then, they already knew. The footage had reached every corner of the family, and the silence of others had spoken louder than any confrontation I could have staged. They moved quickly from room to room, pulling open drawers, lifting cushions, searching for the things they believed still belonged to them. And with every slam of a door, with every frustrated breath, I felt no fear, only a strange calm, because I had already secured everything, and what remained for them was not money or papers, but the heavy knowledge of what they had done. Their voices rose, sharp and frantic, anger bleeding into blame as they turned on each other. The laughter that once filled my kitchen replaced by accusations and shame, and I let it play out like an echo I did not need to answer. I thought of how easily they had mocked me, how they had treated my private words as entertainment. And now it was their own actions being passed around, their own shame being spoken of in whispers at family tables, and that balance felt like justice, not revenge, but a mirror held to their faces, so they could see what I had seen. They called my name eventually, their tone shifting from anger to forced sweetness, but I did not rise. I did not answer. Because there are times when silence carries more power than 1,000 words. And I wanted them to sit with the emptiness they had created. The house they once treated as their playground was no longer theirs to roam freely. The trust they once counted on was no longer theirs to lean on. And the image they once tried to project of loyalty and love was no longer believable to anyone who had watched that video. I sat quietly in my chair, hands folded, heart steady, and I understood that what I had taken back was not only my home or my savings, it was my peace, the right to live without fear under my own roof, and no matter what they said or how loudly they tried to erase the truth, I knew they could never steal that from me again. As I sat there listening to their voices fade into uneasy silence, I realized they were no longer looking for money or papers. They were searching for a way back into the safety of my trust. But that door had been closed, and it was not one I intended to open again. They spoke of misunderstandings, tried to paint their laughter as a harmless game, but the evidence had already spoken louder than their words. And the family who had watched that footage now knew the truth as clearly as I did. So their excuses rang hollow, like stones rattling in an empty jar. I kept my gaze steady, my lips pressed into calm silence, because there was no need for me to fight. The fight had already ended when I chose dignity over anger, and now all that remained was the weight of their shame. For once, it was not me carrying the burden, it was them, their shoulders sagging under the realization that what they thought was hidden had been revealed. Not just to me, but to everyone they once tried to impress. And as I looked at them, I felt a strange mix of sorrow and strength. Sorrow that the bond I had nurtured with such care had withered into betrayal. But strength that I had faced the truth without letting it destroy me. I understood then that justice does not always arrive with noise or punishment. Sometimes it arrives in the quietest way, by letting people face the reflection of their own choices. And that is a weight heavier than any punishment I could ever give. They left the room eventually, their voices low, their steps slower than before. And in that moment, I knew the balance had shifted forever. Because I no longer feared them, I no longer felt the need to shield them, and I no longer doubted my worth. What had once been my weakness had turned into my shield, and the silence they mocked had become the very silence that now stood taller than all their excuses. When the house finally grew quiet again, and I was left alone with my thoughts, I felt no emptiness, only a calm strength that wrapped around me like a blanket, because I knew I had faced betrayal without losing myself to bitterness. I thought of all the years I had poured into building a life of honesty and sacrifice. And though his choices had wounded me deeply, I also knew that I had risen above them with dignity, showing that age does not strip away power. It deepens it. The truth had been revealed, the shame was theirs to carry, and my peace was mine to keep. And in that knowledge, I found a kind of freedom I had not felt in many years. Thank you for staying with me until the end of my story. Your presence means more than I can ever say. And if my words have touched you, please share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe, so we can continue walking through these stories together.